Hello friends, for today's video I want to go through a collection of books that I think don't just solely fall under the umbrella of being character driven or plot driven, but rather in addition to those things, they are thematically driven. I say in addition to rather than that they are thematically driven instead of, because of the fact that I think a lot of times when there are themes present, whether they are subtle or are overt, whenever there's something that the author is trying to convey or whether they are trying to hit home a certain point and have that be an integral part of the story, oftentimes it either is in addition to a plot-driven story where the themes are so well intertwined with it that it broadens the plot and it makes the plot have higher stakes because it feels like we can understand why everything needs to go a certain way. We recognize what the threats might be, and we recognize if things don't go well, if things go wrong, then we have an idea of what that's going to result in, and it naturally kind of makes us care as readers. But then on the flip side, you can have thematically driven stories that are well intertwined with character driven stories as well, because of the fact that a lot of times themes can be things that are deeply, deeply personal. It allows for the characters to feel like they're real people, and naturally we are endeared to them, we care about them, we want them to push through whatever it is that they're going through or whatever is being forced upon them. We want them to break away from it. And I find for myself stories that have this additional piece to them are some of the ones that have the longest lasting impacts, pull at my heart. And also I think for a lot of us, these are the books that make us kind of sit back and analyze not just ourselves, but how we fit into all of society. And it makes us, I think, oftentimes do some deep reflection, and it poses a lot of really great questions. Now, just because a book has a lot of really important themes doesn't mean they always work for us. So I'm going to go through a collection of books that I think do all of what I'm describing, even though not necessarily all of these are going to work for every single person. At the end of the day, at the very least, I think they are great for having a great discussion. These would be great book club picks. But regardless, before I give my list of recommendations for books that I think are great at doing everything I described, I would love to know what are your recommendations for books that you just feel like have such an enormous impact and maybe have even reshaped your worldview or reshaped you as a person. I would love to know. But anyway, all of that said, let's jump into it. The first two that I'm going to start out with are both written by the same author. There is a reason that these are two of my favorite books of all time. I think this author is masterful at weaving themes into the story and making you care about the characters and having the plots progress in a way where you just don't want to stop turning the page. And that would be Sword of Kaigen and Blood over Brighthaven. Sword of Kaigen is one of those books that until you've read it, you're going to hear people talk about over and over again. This book took me aback. I couldn't believe the things that happened in this book. I had such an emotional reaction to this book. You're going to hear that over and over again. And I know in today's way of talking about books, where it feels like people frequently are crying in videos or are having these really big reactions, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but it can feel sometimes, especially in short form content, like we try to get people's attention because we so badly want to connect with other people over the books we're reading, but we have these big reactions to things, and sometimes it can result in something feeling overhyped. There's no way you feel like I can go into a book and possibly feel the same way all these other people feel. Sword of Kaigen is, I think, one of the few that the general consensus, of course, there's going to be outliers and exceptions, but I feel like the general consensus is I heard everybody saying this, and then I read it, and then I understood. The setup for Sword of Kaigen is you follow this society that they very much feel strongly about the fact that they are the sword. They are the first group of people to defend the population if there is ever a threat, and they will do anything they have to ensure that people are protected. And we follow a few different perspectives within this one family. We follow a mother as well as her young son. And he, at the beginning of the story, he has a very almost innocent worldview. And he starts to have that worldview slightly tweaked when he interacts with somebody who comes to the Sword of Kaigen for the first time. And they seem to have a very different worldview. And suddenly our character has this almost like Matrix moment where it feels like this glitch in the system where, wait a second, that's not everything I've always been told. And they start questioning things, and the mother of this young man is proud of him for questioning and proud of him for wanting to form his own worldview, but at the same time, she is deeply, deeply afraid of what that might cost him. And this is where the propaganda side of the story plays a role. And you start to see the cracks in this supposedly perfect protective shield of a population of people. The way that the story progresses, it starts out feeling very casual. And also there are times, I know for myself, when I picked it up, for a while I thought, this is a little strange. I felt like it took a while for me to get my feet on the ground as far as recognizing the tone and feeling invested in the characters, and I just felt out of sorts for a while. And then when things get heavy, you understand. And it really shows the price of fighting back. It also shows what happens to somebody when they do everything perfectly because they are so afraid of the governing body of their country. When they do everything they're quote unquote supposed to do, and yet the worst can still happen. And how does that impact a person? What does it do to them? How does it impact the rest of their family? How do they move forward through that? Does it make them more resilient? Does it break them? Does it transform them? It is exceptionally well done. And I think it's a book that for so many people, they're going to pull different things from it. But at the end of the day, I think if we're talking about something that's both character driven and thematically driven, this story does that exceptionally. And then we have Blood Over Bright Haven by this same author. And I would argue that you could say propaganda is a little bit a part of this story, but I think a bigger thing is the way that entire groups of people can be convinced of a narrative despite never having interacted with certain groups of people, despite never actually deeply thinking about a certain topic. If they are just told something time and time again, they just sort of go with it, even when they themselves are part of a group of oppressed people, and thus they should be able to transfer that feeling and apply it through empathy towards other groups and recognize, well, if I know that people have misunderstood me or had stupid beliefs about me just because of something that's outside of my control, if I have that feeling, I should be able to recognize that in others. But instead, people sadly can sometimes be very selfish and very narrow in their view of things, and they sometimes only view themselves through what they've experienced and are incapable at times, it feels like, of recognizing that they might be doing the same thing to someone else. And this is where our main character of Blood Over Bright Haven kind of enters the picture. She is somebody who, based in their society and their views, she has had far fewer opportunities to excel in her academics, and she is a brilliant mind, and she knows that she is just as capable, if not more capable, than so many of the people around her. So you want to root for her because she's an underdog, but then you see the way that she is completely blind to the way that she views other groups of people, and this kind of comes to a head when she and somebody from a group that she doesn't really look at fondly necessarily. It's not that she actively dislikes them, but she just has never really questioned what she's been taught about them. When they basically have to work together through their magic system, the way that it not only does all of that, but then also examines the way that people who have immigrated from somewhere else, the way that they are treated in a society, how all of that is done within this, on top of so many other themes, because this has so many layers and layers and layers to it. The way all of that done is fantastic. Plus, especially in Blood Over Bright Haven, there's a very, very interesting, almost scientific feeling magic system. I would say in sort of Kaigen, it feels almost more like Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically the individuals with water magic. So I definitely think there's also fun fantasy pieces of this as well, and the world building is really cool. But both of them, the way that they execute their themes is masterful. I can't wait to see if this author does choose to write more books, which I really hope that she does. I can't wait to see what she writes next. The next two books I want to mention, or rather the next two series that I want to mention, I think both, despite the fact that they tell their stories very differently, and one has characters you root for and the other has characters that are fairly despicable oftentimes, I still think that they are both examining the way that the way that society can function based off of a certain kind of government, and also the way that power can corrupt. And those two series would be the Aurelian Cycle as well as Age of Madness. And Age of Madness is much, much more, of course, grimdark fantasy, or at the very least grimdark fantasy adjacent, depending on your definition of grimdark fantasy. But at the very least, the themes feel very bleak, because what they do oftentimes in this story through the characters is we see individuals who currently hold a decent amount of privilege within their society, and they want to gain more and more and more. They basically want to suck everything dry until they have more, and they couldn't care less how it negatively impacts other people. Until you actually see, and there's somewhat of an industrial revolution feeling to the Age of Madness trilogy, when people rise up and they fight back, the level of violence that it takes, first off, to have any kind of change sometimes, when over and over and over again you have developed a very callous group of people at the top, what it takes to actually open those people's eyes to the fact that the general population is very dissatisfied with how they're being treated, and how they're being treated is not okay. That does open some people's eyes, but in, I would say, Joe Abercrombie's typical fashion, rather than the characters suddenly becoming heroic, we see characters double down and buckle down, and now they seem almost more antagonistic. They are willing to do whatever they have to do to ensure that they never experience that again. And oftentimes, whatever privilege they had before, they want even more so that they have even more of a safety net. And through all of this, there's actually a lot of humor baked in, and also it just kind of examines the most selfish parts of ourselves, and the way that even when things start to change, usually that change really only looks different in the way society is from the outside and kind of in a superficial way, rather than actually benefiting the lives of the everyday people that fought so hard and lost so much. It's fantastic, and also the level of snark towards the way that governments function and the way that people come up with policy changes and trade and all of these things is exceptional. Also, even though I said pretty much every character is despicable, shockingly, there's a character that starts out being like, oh, I can't stand this character, and by the end is one of my favorite characters in anything I've read by Abercrombie. I love this character so much. Now, I do want to note, if you have only read The Devils by Joe Abercrombie, I do think that the First Law trilogy and Age of Madness, they're very different. So I know for myself, if I had read The Devils first, I don't know that I would have wanted to pick up the other series that I just mentioned, but I do think that the other series are very, very different. So if you haven't liked one, I would say still give these a try. Additionally, because Age of Madness is a continuation series, it is advised that you read First Law first, and that is my recommendation. You can try to just go for Age of Madness. You won't be necessarily too in the dark, but it is, of course, going to have probably a little bit more of an impact if you've read the original trilogy first. And also, the original trilogy has plenty of the same kinds of things I was just describing, and it's also a little bit more almost feeling like satire of the traditional hero's journey. It takes traditional character archetypes as well, and it just plays around with that in a way that's pretty fun, but also it is kind of examining how very few people are actually heroic, and it's all just about how the story gets told as opposed to what actually happened. And then with the Aurelian Cycle, the reason that I was kind of having these two spoken of at the same time or in relation to each other is because I talked about how in Age of Madness it really is showing that when there is some kind of uprising or there is some kind of revolution, how things play out after and how messy and bleak and violent that can be. The Aurelian Cycle has more distance from the revolution. The setup for the story is that our main characters were children when a revolution happened, and now that they are going from children into adulthood, they are starting to see the way that previously they thought that this revolution was going to actually lead to more equality, but there are problems with this new form of government as well. And even though it benefits some people certainly far more than the previous type of government did, it's not without its faults. And so you are examining that specifically through our main characters, Lee and Annie. And the biggest thing that kind of differentiates them from the rest of the population is the fact that they are dragon riders. And what happens when any one individual has some means of power at that level? They basically have a weapon at their disposal, so that even when we try to do things fairly, what happens when somebody who has what is basically a weapon in the form of a dragon, what if they are displeased with the changes? What if they're displeased with the general population? Or what happens when there's a food shortage and only some people are allotted food? What are they going to do? Probably the people that have more power, the ones that are going to have the most access to things. So you're starting to examine the flaws of the system. And through a lot of Annie and Lee's history and their past, they come together and then come apart so many times. I think Age of Madness, while the characters are distinct because Abercrombie can write fantastic characters in general, they're not necessarily the most heroic and lovable. Whereas Lee and Annie, I feel like you really, really feel for not just them, but a lot of the side characters as well, especially as the trilogy progresses and you get more characters. You just start to see all these different individuals that are all a piece of something so much bigger than them. The last two that I wanted to mention would be To Shape a Dragon's Breath as well as Babel. And I do want to note with To Shape a Dragon's Breath, and also I'll mention the Aurelian Cycle as well, I've seen both of these considered young adult. I would say with Aurelian Cycle certainly that it is young adult, but even if you're somebody who typically finds you prefer adult fantasy, I think it's still worth giving the Aurelian Cycle a go, because not only does it have all the things I just mentioned that I think are really well done, but there is a maturity to it. It's just through the lens of younger characters. So I don't really think there's anything that makes it so that it feels too, quote unquote, too young for an adult audience. To Shape a Dragon's Breath, recently I've actually seen it sold in adult fantasy in multiple different local bookstores that I like to frequent. So I think that this one kind of can be appealing to a large variety of readers from different ages. And this one is more historical fantasy, and Babel is as well. So with Babel, R.F. Kuang makes it very clear that it is more of a historical fantasy, but there are some things about it that are tweaked to fit the needs of the story. And with To Shape a Dragon's Breath, it is basically our world, our history, except for there are dragons. Both of these have a component to them that is fantastical, but a lot of the rest of it looks very similar. So right away, we're able to see very clearly the thematic elements that are present. Babel, actually, for me, I really, really loved the themes and what I think R.F. Kuang was going for. I actually would have preferred if we had dug a little bit deeper, but regardless of whether I felt that way or not, so many people really, really resonate with what you see within Babel, which is often people who have a certain level of, they have trials in their life and they have things that make their life difficult, and they do have to push back, kind of like what we were talking about with Blood Over Brighthaven. But the more that they elevate themselves, the more they are part of a system that has taken advantage of and oppressed other groups of people. And once you have your eyes open to that, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you continue to decide, well, I've had to work hard for what I have, and thus I should just continue to get to reap the rewards of that? Or once you reach a certain level of power or privilege, do you then take that and do what you can to help those who you incidentally impacted negatively? And then with To Shape a Dragon's Breath, you are looking at the people who have been negatively impacted by the actions of others. And specifically, you are looking at a young girl who is a part of an indigenous tribe who time and time and time again have, even when they've supposedly honored everything exactly to a T as they were supposed to within certain deals that they've made with people that have come and taken over and conquered so much of the land and so many of their people, even when they do everything quote unquote correctly, they still get taken advantage of, and they still have other force going against their word. And how do they still continue to survive? How do they still continue to have their culture, their family, their customs, when their children are being taken away from them and their food sources are being taken away? And you see a character who is being forced into a certain school because the only way that she can care for this dragon that she has found and has been there when it hatched and it basically imprinted on her, the only way she's allowed to continue to care for it is if she enters into a certain school, and they will teach her how to become a dragon rider. But you are looking at some of the things that they also want her to do and the ways that they want her to assimilate into their culture that somewhat goes against her own, and how she pushes back against that. And just the very nature of her, who she is and where she came from, is seen as a threat to other people, even if she hasn't done anything at all. And so you kind of have the perspectives in this story from Babel and To Shape a Dragon's Breath, they almost feel like they are the reverse. You are looking at somebody who already is a part of a system, and then you are looking at somebody who is forced into a system that they do not want to be a part of. And I really, really think that both of these stories are hitting some very, very, very important themes. I think Babel, Blood Over Bright Haven, and To Shape a Dragon's Breath, if you liked one, there's a decent chance that you will like the others. I actually think To Shape a Dragon's Breath and the Aurelian Cycle, given that they're both historical fantasy, but a kind of, but what if there were dragons feeling, I think for that reason, if you like one, you might like the other. And then Age of Madness is just kind of its own sort of thing, and sort of Kaigen is like, what if Avatar was devastating and so sad. But all of these, I think, are saying a lot in their stories, and they're doing it utilizing the fantasy genre. There have been for years criticisms that genre stories can't really say a whole lot because they're too beholden to the trappings of whatever genre we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about fantasy. And I think there is less of that nowadays. I think a lot of people recognize that you can say really, really meaningful and important things in all sorts of different kinds of genres. And in fact, it almost feels like if somebody can't imagine that something could be important in another genre, it almost feels like they're the ones that are limiting. But regardless, despite the fact that that is not a criticism that I see launched at genres as often these days, it still exists. And I think that these books prove that a book from any given genre has the ability to be saying a lot and really impacting a lot of individuals. It can build our empathy, it can make us understand each other a little bit better, it can make us understand ourselves and our societies a little bit better. And I think that all these books at the very least are aiming for that. The last thing I'll note as well is just because a story maybe isn't so overt in the fact that it might be thematically driven, maybe something is more on the fun side, the lighthearted side, doesn't mean that it doesn't still have value. A book doesn't have to be trying to say the most in order to have some kind of meaning. Every book has a different purpose, and sometimes we need the lighthearted, hopeful type of stories. Sometimes we need the sweeter stories. Sometimes we need the ones that are just fun because maybe what we're going through in our own lives is so heavy that that helps us push through. And then other times it's good to sit back and examine society through the lens of fiction, which I think a lot of these books do. So in no way by talking about these books am I saying, see, these authors are doing fiction right or anything like that. I just think that they are doing something that is important in its own way. Regardless, if you have any of your own recommendations, either books that you just think are really, really great at how they present their themes, or maybe based off the ones I mentioned, you have some of a, if you like this, try that sort of recommendations. Regardless, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. If you're interested in checking any of these out, I'll have them linked, and if I have more in-depth reviews for any of them, I'll have those linked as well. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.